Darnell Mitchell had always been a man of routine. At 28 years old, he had learned the rhythm of the city, a place where the noise never truly stops, but sometimes, in the quieter corners, you find the peace you need to recharge. The day's work had drained him, but it was the kind of exhaustion that felt earned, the kind that meant his head would hit the pillow with the satisfaction of a job well done. Once in his apartment, he went straight to his closet and pulled out his head spreader and, applying it to his forehead, went to sleep. As he walked through his neighborhood, the hum of traffic fading into the distance, Darnell could already picture the comfort of his apartment, a sanctuary from the world. But tonight, something felt different. There was a weight in the air that couldn't be ignored. The usual chatter of passing cars and distant voices was absent, replaced by an uneasy stillness. As Darnell turned the corner, he spotted the familiar glow of his apartment building's lights in the distance. But before he could reach it, his world shattered. The screech of tires cut through the night. Darnell stiffened as two squad cars came into view, their flashing lights illuminating the sidewalk, casting long, stark shadows on the ground. The suddenness of it made his breath catch in his chest. His heart began to race, a surge of adrenaline pushing his pulse faster. He was too far from home, too alone on this dark street. He glanced over his shoulder. Too late. The officers were already out of their vehicles, rushing toward him with an unsettling urgency. "Stop right there," one of the officers barked, the voice sharp and commanding. The sound of it echoed in the emptiness of the street, making Darnell's throat tighten. His instincts told him to freeze, to obey, but there was no reason for this. He wasn't doing anything wrong. His hands instinctively went up, palm facing out in a gesture of submission. His feet were already taking a half step back, but his mind raced. What is happening? Why me? He tried to remain calm, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. "What's going on?" Darnell asked, his voice quivering despite his efforts to keep it steady. His eyes scanned the officers as they approached, one of them pulling a set of handcuffs from his belt. There was nothing in their demeanor to suggest a reason for this, no explanation, no clue as to why he was the one being targeted. The officers didn't answer. Instead, they moved swiftly, almost mechanically, their movements rehearsed as they closed in on him. Before Darnell could react, he felt the firm grip of a hand on his arm, spinning him around. The force of it stunned him for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. "Hey, what the hell?" He could hear the officers talking over him, words he couldn't quite make out, a blur of command and authority, none of which made any sense. He didn't recognize their faces, didn't see any reason for him to be the one pinned to the car, arms behind his back, his body tense and unmoving under their hands. "This is a mistake," Darnell tried again, his voice growing louder as he twisted in their grip. "I haven't done anything." His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, all disjointed and jumbled. Why me? What did they think I did? But the officers didn't respond. They didn't even acknowledge his protests. One of them yanked his arms tighter, tightening the cuffs with a pressure that sent a sharp pain shooting through his wrists. His breath hitched, the sudden discomfort grounding him in the reality of the situation. He was caught in something he didn't understand, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His thoughts scrambled for a reason, some logical explanation that could justify why this was happening. But there was nothing. No theft, no disturbance, no threat. Darnell had done nothing. He had no criminal record. He was just a man walking home from a long day's work. Another one heavily officer person, one of the officers, a taller man with short cropped hair and a hardened face, pulled out a notepad, flipping through it quickly. He muttered something to his partner, who nodded. The pair exchanged a few words Darnell couldn't hear clearly, but the coldness in their voices was enough to send a chill down his spine. This wasn't just a routine stop. It felt personal, and the weight of that thought was enough to make his stomach twist. "Where's your ID?" The officer's voice was low, demanding, but there was a certain irritation in his tone, as if Darnell's confusion was only adding to his frustration. "ID? What the hell for?" Darnell's mind raced, the need to defend himself bubbling to the surface. "You can't just arrest me without telling me why." The taller officer leaned in closer, his breath heavy against Darnell's ear. "You're under suspicion for theft in the area. You fit the description. That's all the reason we need." The man's targeted words fell stronger and more convincing, as if Caden were fully aware of his surroundings and reduced to fear. Darnell froze. "Theft? Me?" He wanted to scream, to argue back, but his words were swallowed by the overwhelming sense of powerlessness. The world was spinning too fast. He wasn't just being detained. They were making him feel like a criminal when he wasn't. There was no evidence, no reason, but the system had already decided. He was guilty by his mere presence. "Please," Darnell said, his voice quieter now, strained with the weight of his fear. "I didn't do anything. I'm just trying to get home." The officer ignored him, continuing to check his ID as if Darnell's words didn't matter. But as the officer fumbled through the papers, Darnell felt something shift in the air, an unsettling silence. He could sense the uncertainty, the confusion from the officers. It was as if they too were questioning what they had done. But the damage was already done. Darnell had been caught in a nightmare, and he didn't know how to wake up. He closed his eyes for a moment, his thoughts flashing to the struggles of his neighborhood, the stories of people wronged by the system, by authority. He had never wanted to be one of those stories, but now it seemed inevitable. Was he just another name in a long list of forgotten faces? Before the officer could say anything else, there was a slight hesitation in his movements, the shift in his body language noticeable. Something wasn't right. Darnell could feel it, a strange sense of foreboding creeping up his spine. It wasn't over yet. Darnell had barely made it past the corner of his block when the flash of blue and red lights cut through the darkness, seizing his attention like an electric shock. His heart leapt into his throat. What now? The sudden appearance of two squad cars, their headlights slicing through the night, filled the air with tension, the kind of tension that could only mean something was wrong. Darnell instinctively froze, unsure of what to do, his fingers clenched into fists at his sides, his breath shallow and quick as the police cars screeched to a halt just a few feet from him. The officers stepped out with swift, deliberate movements, their faces obscured by dark sunglasses, even though the night had long settled in. Darnell squinted into the blinding light of the patrol car, trying to read their intentions, but their expressions were hidden behind the glass and shadows. The sudden appearance of these strangers on his street was enough to send his nerves into overdrive. "Hey, what's going on?" Darnell asked, his voice shaky, though he tried to sound calm. His legs felt heavy, and his thoughts were a blur. Why were they stopping me? But before he could process the situation any further, one of the officers lunged forward, grabbing his arm with startling force. The officer yanked him around, spinning him with such speed that Darnell barely had time to react. His body jerked as he was pulled out of his personal space, and in an instant, he was facing the officer, his chest pounding. "What did I do?" Darnell stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt weak in his mouth, but it was the only thing he could manage in that moment. His mind was racing. Did I break some kind of law? Was I doing something suspicious without even realizing it? The officer didn't even look at him as he spoke, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "You're under arrest," he said, as though reading from a script. The words hung in the air like a nightmare unfolding. Darnell blinked, his stomach flipping over. He couldn't understand. There had to be some mistake, a mix-up. He hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't even sure what he was being arrested for. His legs went weak, and a cold sweat beaded on his forehead. This wasn't real, was it? "Wait, what for?" Darnell's voice cracked as panic began to rise in his chest. He couldn't stop his hands from shaking, and for a moment, it felt like the world was spinning too fast. The officer, who was gripping his arm tightly, gave him no answer, no clarification. The words, the explanations, none of it came. Instead, Darnell felt the sharp pressure of a hand on his back, shoving him forward with no care for the confusion written all over his face. Before he knew it, his back slammed hard against the cold metal of the squad car. The shock of the impact made him gasp, his body jolting painfully. He opened his mouth to protest again, but a firm hand pressed against his chest, pushing him further into the side of the vehicle. The officer was already pulling out the handcuffs, moving with a practiced speed that made Darnell's heart beat faster.
"No, you can't do this. I haven't done anything."
Darnell's voice grew louder, desperate now. His mind raced with questions, none of them making sense. Suspicious behavior? What behavior? He didn't even know what they thought he'd done. He was just walking home, tired from a long day at work, trying to get back to the apartment he'd been renting for the past 2 years. But the officer didn't answer. He didn't even acknowledge Darnell's words, as though they were irrelevant. His hands were quick, securing the cuffs too tightly around Darnell's wrists. The sting was sharp, a constant reminder of his powerless state. Darnell could feel his pulse racing as his arms were wrenched behind his back, every motion deliberate, like it was part of an unsettling script. He opened his mouth to speak again, to plead his case, but the officer's hand was already on his shoulder, pushing him into the back of the patrol car. "Don't resist," the officer said, his tone clipped and condescending. The words hit Darnell like a slap, cold and dismissive. He felt like his entire body was vibrating with anxiety and disbelief. "This can't be happening." "I'm not resisting," Darnell shot back, though his voice was trembling. His body was still pinned against the car, his chest heavy with confusion. He had never imagined something like this would happen to him, not in a million years. His entire life, he'd stayed out of trouble. He'd kept his head down, worked hard, and never once broken the law. And yet, here he was, being shoved into the back of a police car like a criminal. The door slammed shut behind him, and the sound was deafening, final. The space inside the vehicle was tight, uncomfortable. The moment he was inside, the officers climbed into the front seats, not a word spoken between them. Darnell's eyes darted around the small, dimly lit compartment. His mind was screaming for answers, for any kind of explanation, but all he got was the steady hum of the engine as the car began to move. He felt the wheels of the car grinding against the pavement, the hum of the engine almost drowned out by the heavy beating of his heart in his ears. As they drove, Darnell's thoughts spiraled. What was happening? What was going to happen next? He knew there was no good answer, but he couldn't stop his mind from racing. The uncertainty gnawed at him, and the fear of what lay ahead made it hard to breathe. The officers hadn't said a word. They hadn't offered any explanation. All he knew was that the night, which had started like any other, had turned into something unrecognizable, something terrifying. And with every mile the patrol car traveled, Darnell felt further away from the life he'd known, further away from the safety of his neighborhood, from his home, from the peace he'd sought after a long day's work. The road stretched ahead, dark and unforgiving, but Darnell couldn't stop thinking of one thing. Why? Darnell's body tensed in the back of the patrol car, his wrists raw from the tight cuffs digging into his skin. Every bump in the road felt like a sharp reminder that he was being dragged through this nightmare, helpless. The hum of the engine seemed to mock him, a constant low vibration that only served to heighten his growing frustration. His thoughts were racing, each one tumbling over the other, trying desperately to make sense of the absurdity of it all. What had I done? His mind cycled through the events again and again, desperately searching for some kind of clue, some slip-up, some reason that could justify the officer's actions. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. He hadn't spoken to anyone on the street. He hadn't looked at anyone suspiciously. He was just a man trying to get home after a long, grueling shift. So why had they stopped him? Why had they slammed him against that car, thrown him in cuffs, and driven him to the station without even telling him why? The officer's words echoed in his mind. Suspicious behavior. But what was suspicious about him? About a man simply walking home in the dark? The thought burned in his chest, twisting and nodding as he continued to replay the moment. He could still feel the officer's hand gripping his arm, spinning him around, the cold metal of the cuffs biting into his wrists. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't even had the chance to do anything. The city's streets blurred past him, the lights fading as they pulled further away from his neighborhood. Darnell's stomach tightened. Was this it? Was this what the world saw when it looked at him? A black man on the street at night, someone to be feared, someone to be stopped and searched? He had tried over the years to stay invisible, to not draw attention, to simply get by. But this was something he couldn't ignore. And as the patrol car sped through the night, Darnell felt the crushing weight of the truth settling over him. He was just a statistic, a part of a system that had already decided who he was before he'd even opened his mouth. A young black man living in a neighborhood deemed dangerous, under constant surveillance. This was how the world saw him. And no matter how hard he tried to escape it, no matter how much he proved himself to be more than what society expected, it was never enough. The car finally turned a corner, slowing as it pulled into the precinct. Darnell's pulse quickened, but it wasn't the adrenaline of action. It was the kind of anxiety that comes from knowing you're about to enter a place where your fate will be decided, where your humanity will be reduced to a file number. His mind screamed for clarity, but the only answer he got was the oppressive silence of the car. The officers didn't speak to him as they led him out of the patrol car and through the darkened halls of the precinct. Darnell's shoes echoed on the cold tile floor, the sound hollow and sharp in the quiet. Each step felt heavier than the last, like he was walking through a fog of disbelief and dread. His hands still ached from the cuffs, but it was nothing compared to the tight knot of fear in his chest. At the front desk, one officer spoke briefly to the woman behind the counter, but Darnell barely heard the words. His mind was too clouded, spinning in 1,000 directions, all of them dark. He could hear the low murmur of voices in the background, but they didn't offer him any comfort. He was just another face, another body, another name to be processed. Put him in holding, the officer instructed, and Darnell was guided down a narrow hallway, past a series of cells filled with people, some quiet, some muttering, some pacing. He was shoved into a small sterile holding cell and the door slammed shut behind him with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine. The lock clicked, sealing him inside. Darnell slumped against the cold metal bench, his mind still spinning. He could hear the faint sounds of muffled conversations from the other cells, but it all felt so distant, so disconnected. There was no sense of humanity in the space, just cold walls and the echo of time slipping by. Slowly, steadily. He couldn't help but glance around the small, dimly lit room. The concrete walls were cracked in places, the paint peeling, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. It was a place designed to make people feel small, insignificant, and Darnell felt that more than anything. Like the world had shrunk him down to the size of a statistic, a prisoner, before he'd even been charged with anything. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed. Time felt strange in the holding cell, stretching and compressing, as though the clock was playing tricks on him. He had no idea what was happening outside, or even what was going to happen to him. No one had told him why he was here, what the charges were, or even if there were any charges at all. The silence around him was deafening, oppressive. He could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thicker with each passing moment. As the hours dragged on, the reality of his situation started to sink in, a slow, gnawing dread settling in his gut. He tried to stay calm, but the uncertainty was a weight he couldn't escape. What would happen to him? Would this nightmare end, or would he remain trapped in this limbo, without answers, without justice? His throat tightened as he tried to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. I haven't done anything wrong, he thought again, over and over. But the longer he sat there, the more he began to wonder if it mattered. The minutes stretched endlessly, each second feeling like a weight pressing on Darnell's chest. His mind was still racing from the confusion and frustration of the night. The silence around him was oppressive, a thick fog that only deepened as the hours passed. The sterile, flickering light above seemed to mock his growing sense of unease, casting a cold glow that highlighted the grim reality of his situation. He had no idea what was happening, why he was being detained, or if he'd ever be released. Finally, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside his cell. Darnell's heart gave a quick thud against his ribs as the door to his cell creaked open and a weary officer stepped inside. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair at his temples, his uniform slightly rumpled from a long shift. He didn't make eye contact, his face set in the kind of neutral expression that suggested he'd been through 100 similar situations. Mitchell, the officer said, his voice low and detached, as if reading from a script. You're still in here. Darnell sat up straighter, trying to suppress the wave of anxiety that washed over him. He'd spent the last few hours staring at the blank walls, replaying the events over and over in his mind, waiting for some explanation. What's going on? What are you charging me with? He asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. The officer didn't immediately respond. He seemed to ignore the question entirely, instead pulling out a clipboard from the bag at his side. The sound of paper rustling filled the silence, punctuated only by the occasional distant noise from other cells. Darnell's palms became slick with sweat as he watched the officer's every movement. ID, the officer said flatly, holding out his hand without looking up. Darnell's mind reeled. He was too tired, too beaten down by the whole situation to even process why the officer was asking for his identification now. He fumbled with his wallet, his fingers numb and stiff from the cold. It took a moment, but he finally pulled out his driver's license and handed it over, his pulse quickening as the officer took it from him with barely a glance. Here, Darnell said, the words coming out rough. Take it. He couldn't stop the bitterness that seeped into his voice. This whole thing felt wrong, like a terrible misunderstanding he couldn't explain. The officer didn't speak as he flipped the card over, squinting as he scanned the information. His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't comment. Instead, he turned to the clipboard in his hands, checking a few more things, before looking back at the screen of his handheld device. Darnell's mind raced. What was going on? Why was this taking so long? The seconds stretched like hours, and the tension in the room built slowly, almost imperceptibly. Darnell leaned forward, trying to peer over the officer's shoulder to see what was going on, but the man held the device out of his view. He could see the officer's fingers moving over the screen in rapid succession, then flipping through the papers again. A sudden stillness fell over the officer as he paused, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the data in front of him. Darnell's breath hitched in his chest, his body going rigid. Something wasn't right. The officer's eyes flicked back to the screen, then down at the clipboard, his lips pressed into a thin line. Darnell's heart skipped a beat. The tension thickened in the air. the silence deafening. The officer muttered something under his breath, but Darnell could only hear the pounding of his own heartbeat, a rhythmic drum beat that drowned out everything else. He had the sudden, irrational fear that the officer might not say anything at all, that he might just leave him here forever, without a word. Why FOMO? But after what felt like an eternity, the officer looked up at him, his face slightly pale. For the first time since the arrest, the officer seemed unsettled, his usually stoic expression now shadowed by a flicker of confusion, or perhaps disbelief. "You wanted to murder me," he croaked. "Mr. Mitchell," the officer said slowly, as if testing the name on his tongue. "This doesn't make sense." "Ah." Darnell stared at him, trying to mask the panic rising in his chest. Doesn't make sense? Was he finally going to be let go? Or was this just another cruel twist in his already nightmarish ordeal? The officer turned back to the clipboard again, then to the screen, double-checking the details. The confusion on his face deepened, but still he didn't speak further. Darnell swallowed hard, his throat dry. What's going on? What does that mean? What doesn't make sense? He didn't even care anymore if he sounded desperate. He needed to know what was happening. He needed answers. The officer paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts, before letting out a heavy sigh. I'm going to have to get someone else to look at this," he said quietly, still shaking his head. He turned away from Darnell without offering any explanation, his hand still gripping the clipboard as he walked out of the holding area. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Darnell alone in the dim cell once again. His mind raced, his thoughts spinning in confusion. What did the officer mean? What had he found in his ID that was causing all this uncertainty? The officer had looked at the information with something like shock. What could be so surprising about a routine ID check? Darnell's fingers twitched at his sides. His gut twisted in unease as the seconds dragged by in silence, stretching on like an unbearable eternity. Something had changed. Something was different now. But what? What had just happened? He sank back down onto the cold bench, his body exhausted, his heart still hammering in his chest. The officer's unease, the pause in the conversation, it all pointed to something. But what? What had the officer found in his records? Darnell couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't going to make this night end the way he'd thought it would. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating Darnell's thoughts. "You're not the person we thought you were." Darnell looked down at the photograph of Diana. His mind scrambled, trying to process what the officer was saying. What did that even mean? Who did they think he was? For a moment, it felt like the world around him had shifted, like the ground beneath his feet was no longer steady. He stared at the two officers standing in front of him, their faces a mix of disbelief and, strangely, frustration. The officer who had first approached him, he looked older, maybe in his 40s, glanced over at his partner, his lips pressing into a thin line. This is a mess," he muttered, pacing a few steps away from the holding cell, clearly trying to piece together what had just transpired. Darnell was still standing, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt the rush of heat flood his face, the blood rising to his cheeks as the weight of the situation pressed on him. This was absurd. What had they gotten wrong? What could they possibly have thought about him that was now making them scramble? "Can you just tell me what's going on?" Darnell's voice cracked, the frustration finally spilling over. "I've been locked in this damn cell for hours. I haven't been told anything, and now you tell me you don't even know who I am?" His hands were still cuffed behind his back, but the anger surged through him anyway. It was impossible to stay calm anymore. The officers exchanged glances, and for the first time, Darnell saw a flicker of hesitation in their eyes. The older officer stepped forward, rubbing his forehead like he was trying to shake off the confusion that was clouding his thoughts. "Look, we thought we had a suspect." He started slowly, his voice strained, as if he didn't want to admit the mess that had unfolded. Two of the officers started to turn away, heading back towards the cars with Darnell. "We were tracking someone who matches your description, but when we ran your ID, we found something that doesn't line up with what we were expecting." Who were you expecting?" Darnell asked, his voice rising with incredulity. "What did you think I did?" The younger officer, who had been standing quietly, suddenly spoke up. His words were clipped, clearly reluctant. "We were looking for someone involved in a string of robberies in the area," he said. "A black male about your height and build. We got a tip and your description matched." Darnell's stomach dropped. He stared at the officers, processing the words that had just come out of the younger officer's mouth. They thought he was a criminal. They had targeted him because of his appearance, because of the color of his skin and the neighborhood he walked through. And now they were standing in front of him, trying to make sense of the mess they had caused. "So you just saw a black man walking down the street and you thought I was the guy you were looking for?" Darnell's words were bitter, laced with disbelief and anger. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. Not again. Not like this. The older officer's expression softened for a moment, but only briefly. "It's not like that," he said, his voice quieter now. "We had reason to think you were the one. We were wrong, okay? We ran your ID and now you're just standing here trying to explain it to me," Darnell interrupted. His hands clenched into fists behind his back, frustration bubbling over in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. "You can't just arrest someone, put them in a holding cell, and then say, 'Oops, we made a mistake.'" The officer's face tightened, and Darnell saw a flicker of guilt flash across his features. Darnell's chest tightened as the officer's words hit him like a slap. The system. The phrase was all too familiar. He knew exactly what the officer was referring to. The racial profiling, the assumption that someone who looked like him could be guilty of anything just because of the way he appeared. But the reality of it, the fact that it had happened to him yet again, made Darnell's stomach churn. All these years he had tried to stay out of trouble, tried to avoid attention, tried to do everything right. And now this. Now they had put him in a cell, treated him like a criminal, and didn't even bother to check the facts until it was too late. "I didn't do anything," Darnell said, the words coming out slowly, as though he were trying to convince himself just as much as the officers. He shook his head. "You never even gave me a chance to explain. You just assumed." The older officer nodded, looking like he had aged a decade in the past few minutes. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." For a long moment, no one spoke. Darnell stood there, still handcuffed, his mind spinning. His body felt like it had been drained of energy, the adrenaline that had been rushing through him earlier now replaced by a deep, exhausting frustration. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner, who was still staring at the paperwork in his hands. Finally, the older officer sighed, looking up at Darnell. Darnell didn't know what to say. His emotions swirled, anger, confusion, exhaustion, all tangled together. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he simply nodded, his throat tight. The officer walked over, unlocking the cuffs with a quiet click, the metal cold against his wrists. The officer's voice, laden with an uncomfortable sense of guilt, echoed through the sterile, dimly lit holding room. "We made a mistake." Darnell's mind churned, the frustration bubbling inside him like an untamed storm. His pulse had slowed somewhat, the shock of the arrest beginning to wear off, but a heavy weight remained, pressing down on him with every breath. He wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that they had grabbed the wrong person, or the realization that this could happen to anyone who looked like him, simply because of his skin and the way the system saw people like him. The officer who had spoken stepped back, his gaze uncertain, as if unsure of what to do next. His partner stood by the door, his arms crossed, his face still tight with confusion. Darnell took a deep breath, the cool air of the cell doing little to calm his racing thoughts. "You arrested me," Darnell said quietly, his voice steady, but laced with an unmistakable edge. "But you didn't even check before you did it. You just assumed." The older officer shifted uneasily under Darnell's gaze. "We were working off a description. We didn't know it was you. It was just a mistake. But it doesn't change the fact that we should have done better." "A description," Darnell repeated, his mind cycling back to that moment on the street, the flash of blue and red lights, the officers descending on him without a word of explanation. "You didn't stop me because you saw me doing anything wrong. You didn't even ask me anything. You just saw a black guy in a neighborhood and assumed you had your man, right?" The words were sharp, a truth that stung, even as they left his mouth. Darnell felt an ugly knot twist in his stomach. The thought that, just a few hours ago, he had been yanked from the street, thrown into the back of a squad car, and treated like a criminal was almost too much to process. Whatever triumph faced before wasn't likely to be for real. It wasn't the arrest itself that hurt the most, but the weight of a system that so easily reduced him to nothing more than a name on a page, an object to be scrutinized and handled, rather than a person with rights, dignity, and the freedom to walk home at the end of his day. "We should have verified the information," the officer said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "I'm sorry. I can't take back what happened. But we'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Darnell scoffed, the hollow apology not doing a thing to ease the raw ache that had formed inside him. "What's done is done. You can't unring the bell, but you know what? It's not just me. It's people like me, people who look like me, who get caught in this same trap every day." The officer, who had been silent for most of the exchange, finally spoke. "It's not like we were targeting you. You don't even know the half of it," Darnell interrupted, his voice rising again. "It's not just one mistake. It's the whole damned system. You think because you see a guy in a hoodie walking down the street at night it's okay to just stop him and throw him in a cell? I'm not the first, and I won't be the last." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. He didn't seem to have an answer, but the older officer nodded in acknowledgement, his shoulders slumping as though he was carrying a burden too heavy to shake off. "Agent Milester." Darnell stood there for a long moment, the silence between them stretching uncomfortably. He wanted to say more, wanted to scream about the countless injustices, the hours of his life lost, the way his body had been handled like a suspect, the way his very identity had been twisted into something criminal. But in the end, no words would fix the damage that had been done. Darnell shook off the feeling of enjoyment and started slowly putting on his clothes, heading for the front door, in time for the sunrise. Darnell started looking around before glancing back at his brother. In the end, no words would fix the damage that had been done. He wanted to hold his brother, but he feared he couldn't. He stared at the officers, their faces full of guilt and frustration. And for the first time that night, Darnell felt something else, a deep, aching weariness. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about all the others, the ones who had faced the same fate, the ones who hadn't been as lucky, who hadn't been able to walk out of that holding cell, who hadn't had their names cleared. "You don't get it," Darnell said softly, shaking his head. This is just how it is. For me, for so many people who look like me, it's not just a mistake, it's a pattern. The officers didn't respond. They couldn't. They didn't know what it was like to walk through life with that constant sense of being watched, of being judged by a system that had already decided who you were before you even opened your mouth. Darnell let out a slow, steady breath. His body was tired, his hands still sore from the cuffs. The sharp, raw edge of his anger was starting to dull, replaced by something colder, more resigned. He'd always known this could happen. Hadn't he felt it in his gut every time a cop had passed him on the street, eyes scanning him with suspicion? Hadn't he heard the stories from friends, family, people who had been there before him? But to live it, to feel that tight grip on his arm, the helplessness as he was shoved into that squad car, to be treated like a criminal for simply existing, it was something else entirely. The officers stood in silence, waiting for him to say something, but Darnell had nothing left to say. Not to them, not to anyone. "Right," I said. "I'm ready to go," he muttered, turning his back to them, his voice barely a whisper. The officer who had been more reluctant to speak stepped forward, unlocking the holding cell door. It creaked open, the cold, metallic sound echoing through the quiet room. Without another word, Darnell stepped out, his legs unsteady, his mind a blur of confusion and anger. The weight of the handcuffs still felt like a phantom presence on his wrists, even though they had long since been removed. As he walked out of the station, the night air hit him like a slap in the face, harsh and forgiving. But at least he was free. At least for now. Darnell stands there for a moment, the weight of everything crashing down on him all at once. His fists clench at his sides, but he forces himself to relax, taking a slow, steadying breath. He's been through a lot in his life, far more than any person should ever have to endure, and he's learned the hard way that sometimes letting anger consume you only gives them that satisfaction. The last thing he wants to do is give them that satisfaction. But the apology from the young officer catches him off guard. He glances at her, her eyes full of remorse, her posture tense, like she's not sure whether she's just added to his pain or somehow helped ease it. Next, they walk down the shadowy length of the street in silence as they return to the ship's port and begin their slow descent. "I'm sorry," she says again, softer now, like she's afraid he might not believe her. "I know this shouldn't have happened. It wasn't right." Piet nods slowly, embarrassed at how profoundly painful it sounds. Darnell stares at her for a long moment. He can see that her apology is genuine. But that doesn't change what he's been through. That doesn't change the fact that for hours he was treated like a criminal, for no reason at all. His pulse begins to spike again, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. They got it wrong. They all got it wrong. Graham can trust, but as the seconds pass, his anger begins to subside, replaced by a deep, aching sense of exhaustion. He's so tired. Tired of the system. Tired of the injustice. Tired of being constantly surveilled, judged, and wronged. And yet here he stands, face to face with someone who is genuinely sorry. Someone who, in her own way, recognizes the error, even if it's too late to undo the damage. "It's not enough," Darnell finally says, his voice low, measured. "I don't know if anything can make up for what you did, for what you all did." The young officer's face tightens in sympathy, but she doesn't respond. She just waits, as if she's unsure of how to proceed, unsure of how to make it right when the harm has already been done. Darnell shakes his head. "It's not about you. Not really. You didn't make the mistake, but you're part of a system that keeps making them. People like me don't get the luxury of 'I'm sorry'. We just get swept under the rug." He can see that his words hit her, the way her eyes flicker with recognition, the way she looks down briefly, as if reflecting on the deeper truth of what he's saying. I get it, she says quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. And I wish there was more I could do, but all I can offer you right now is my apology. Darnell nods, but it feels empty. Apologies don't heal wounds, he thinks. They don't undo the hours of fear, the humiliation, the realization that the color of my skin made me a target from the moment I stepped out of my door. Just be better next time, Darnell mutters, turning away from her. Make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. As he walks out of the station, the door clanging shut behind him, he can't help but feel a sense of cold bitterness that he can't shake. This isn't the end. This system won't change because of a single apology. This is a constant fight, a battle that so many like him have fought for years. He doesn't know how to fight it, but he knows he has to keep trying, because if he doesn't, who will? Darnell steps into the night, the cool air biting at his skin, but his mind is far from clear. The injustice has left its mark on him, and no matter how many times they apologize, nothing can erase the feeling of being trapped, of being treated as less than human because of something he cannot change. Darnell steps out into the cold night air, the doors of the precinct slamming shut behind him with a finality that echoes through his body. His breath hangs in the air like smoke, his chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. The world around him feels muffled, distant, as though he's trapped in a glass bubble, separated from the very people who should understand him. The anger begins to creep up, slow at first, like a simmering heat in the pit of his stomach. But it quickly builds, coiling tighter and tighter, like a snake constricting around his heart. His fists clench involuntarily at his sides, and for a moment he's overwhelmed by the need to shout, to scream at the injustice, to let it all pour out. The frustration, the hurt, the humiliation, but the words never leave his lips. He swallows them down, deep into the pit of his stomach, where they will continue to fester. Anger won't change anything, he tells himself, the mantra he's repeated to himself countless times. It's a lesson learned early in life, as a young black man growing up in a neighborhood where survival meant keeping your head down, staying out of trouble, and never drawing attention to yourself. Anger, he's been taught, is dangerous. Anger is fuel for those who want to see you fail. And yet the hurt lingers, gnawing at him like an open wound. His body feels tense, as though every muscle is pulled taut with the weight of what happened. He walks briskly down the street, his footsteps echoing in the quiet night, each step an attempt to outrun the feeling of violation. The flash of red and blue lights that started it all, the cold hands of the officers, the empty accusations, they all replay in his mind like a broken record. But it's not just the arrest that eats at him, it's the way he feels, even now, as though he's an outsider in his own city, in his own skin. He's lived here for years, worked here, breathed this same air, yet in moments like this, it feels like he doesn't belong. It's the way people look at him, the way the world sees him, not as Darnell Mitchell, a man with a life and a future, but as a symbol. A statistic, just another black man caught in the gears of a broken system. Right. He rounds the corner, heading toward his apartment, but every step feels heavier than the last. The streets are eerily quiet at this hour, and the silence presses in on him, louder than any sound could. His breath quickens as his thoughts spiral. Why him? The question echoes in his mind, but there are no answers, no explanations, just the gnawing sense of being judged before he's even had a chance to speak. Why does this keep happening? The question lingers like a fog, clouding his thoughts. He's done everything right. He's worked hard, stayed out of trouble, kept his head down, but none of that seems to matter. He's still seen as a threat, still treated as guilty, until proven innocent. And even then, the damage is done. Even if they admit their mistake, the stain of it lingers. It's the fear, the anxiety, the knowing that it could happen again, to him or to anyone who looks like him. As he walks, his anger grows more intense. It's like a fire that won't be quenched, that burns brighter the more he tries to ignore it. He thinks about the officers, about the way they treated him, about the look of disbelief when they realized they'd arrested the wrong man. They were just doing their job, they'll say, just following protocol. But what good is protocol when it's built on assumptions, on stereotypes? And what good is a system that allows mistakes like this to happen so easily? What's the point? The thought cuts through his mind like a knife. What's the point of trying to be good? Of following the rules, if they don't protect you anyway? He's close now to his apartment, the familiar sight of the building just a few blocks away, but the anger in him refuses to subside. He walks faster, each step a rush of adrenaline. They'll never understand, he thinks bitterly. They'll never get it. The ones who wear the badges, who hold the power, they don't see the world through his eyes. They don't know what it's like to walk through life with a target on your back simply because of the color of your skin. And yet, as the anger continues to build, something else begins to stir deep inside him. It's a small flicker at first, something faint but unmistakable. It's the realization that he has to keep going, that despite the rage, despite the hurt, he cannot let this defeat him. He cannot let this world make him feel small, because if he does, if he lets them break him, then they've won. He reaches his apartment building, but the fire inside him is far from out. He takes the steps 2 at a time, his mind still racing with all the things he wants to say, all the things he wants to change. One day this will be different, he tells himself, though the words feel hollow. One day the system will change. One day people like him won't have to live in fear. But for now, he knows he must carry that anger, that frustration. He must channel it into something stronger, something that won't let the fire burn him out. Because if he doesn't, if he lets the world strip away his humanity, then there will be nothing left of him. Darnell reaches his apartment door and pauses, taking a deep breath. He's exhausted, emotionally drained, but as he pushes the door open, he steps inside, ready to face another day. Because no matter what, he refuses to let the weight of the world crush him. Not today. Not ever. Darnell sinks deeper into the worn couch, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his mind remains awake, racing. The apartment is quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of city life that never truly seem to fade. He rubs his face with both hands, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the day, the frustration, the fear, the sense of powerlessness. But it won't go away, not yet. His father sits across from him in the same armchair he's had for years, his posture steady, his face calm but weathered, as though it's been shaped by lifetimes of struggle and resilience. The lines in his face are deep, etched with history that Darnell can't fully grasp, not yet. But in this moment, his father's presence is the one thing that grounds him. Darnell passes his hand over Felix's face and brings it close, pressing his fingers to the forepart to phrase a simple response. When Darnell finishes telling his father about what happened at the precinct, the arrest, the confusion, the overwhelming sense of being unseen, unheard, his father sighs deeply. The sigh isn't one of sympathy, but of understanding. It's a sound that speaks of knowing exactly what his son is feeling, because he's felt it too. Son, his father's voice is firm, steady, like it always is when he's about to drop wisdom. This is the world we live in. You're going to face moments like this. It's not fair, but you have to rise above it, he whispers. Every magical experience has its lesson. He taps my elbow, leading me out of the cathedral. Why? Darnell feels the weight of his father's words settle deep in his chest. He closes his eyes for a moment, fighting back the wave of emotion that threatens to overwhelm him. His father's words are meant to comfort, to give him strength, but the truth of them feels like a cold slap to the face. Rise above it. How many times had he heard those words? More disappointment, only to be faced with more hurdles, more pain, more injustice. And how many more times would he hear them before the weight became too much to bear? Darnell opens his eyes, blinking hard to clear the sting in his vision. He can feel the tears threatening to spill, but he won't let them. Not now, not in front of his father. Instead, he takes a deep breath and lets the frustration spill out in his voice. "I just don't get it, Dad," he says, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to keep it steady. "Why does this keep happening? I'm just trying to live my life." The question hangs in the air, heavy and unanswered. It's a question Darnell has asked himself countless times, but no matter how many times he asks, there's never a clear answer. Why him? Why is he, just a regular man, always caught in the web of this broken system? Why does he have to fight so much harder for the same things everyone else takes for granted? Why does his skin color, his name, his presence somehow make him a target? His father listens without interrupting, his eyes softening as he looks at his son. Darnell doesn't expect a simple answer. He knows better than to think that one can simply explain away the injustices of the world with words. His father has lived through them all, through racism, through oppression, through struggles that Darnell can barely imagine. And yet, he knows exactly what Darnell needs to hear. Finally, his father speaks, his voice deep with years of lived truth. "Because the system isn't built for people like you to succeed," he says, his words blunt but not unkind. "But you can't let them break you. Use this as fuel to prove them wrong." The room goes quiet. Darnell feels the weight of those words, but they don't feel like a balm, like he had hoped. They feel like a challenge, like a heavy truth that he now has to carry with him for the rest of his life. The truth that, no matter how hard he works, no matter how good he tries to be, there will always be a system in place that sees him as less than. And the only way to survive in this world is to keep fighting, to keep pushing, even when everything inside him wants to give up. Darnell looks at his father, who is still sitting across from him, his face calm and sure. There's a quiet strength in the older man's eyes, a strength Darnell has always admired, but never fully understood. Until now. His father has seen it all, lived it all, and somehow he still has the ability to stand tall, to offer wisdom without bitterness. How does he do it? How does he carry all that pain and still find a way to keep going? A lump forms in Darnell's throat, and he bites it back, determined not to show weakness. But the tears well up anyway, the frustration too much to keep inside. His eyes burn as he looks away, unable to meet his father's gaze. It's hard not to feel broken after everything he's been through. It's hard to believe that he can rise above, that he can keep pushing when the world keeps pushing back, harder each time. But then he feels the weight of his father's hand on his shoulder, firm but reassuring. "I know you're tired, son," his father says softly. "But you're stronger than you think, and you don't have to carry this alone." Stengel smiles. If nothing else, it shows a few teeth. Darnell looks back up, surprised by the warmth in his father's voice. For the first time that night, he feels a flicker of something inside him, a tiny spark of hope. A spark that's been buried deep under the weight of frustration and pain. His father is right. This world may be broken, but He doesn't have to let it break him. Darnell takes a deep breath, a shaky exhale as he nods. "I'll prove them wrong, Dad. I'll make sure of it." His father smiles, a quiet, knowing smile that makes Darnell feel like maybe, just maybe, he can do this. "I know you will, son. I know you will." His jaw clenches, his entire body tightens. He smiles at the man and reaches for his phone. And in that moment, Darnell feels a little less alone, a little more capable. The road ahead won't be easy, but with his father's words in his heart, he knows he can keep going, because no matter what the world throws at him, he'll rise above it. Darnell wakes up each morning with a new sense of purpose. The anger that had once simmered inside him now feels like a spark, a flame he can't ignore. As the weeks pass, he channels that energy into activism, determined to make a difference, to turn his pain into something productive. He attends local meetings, offering his perspective, sharing his story. At first it feels strange to speak so openly about what happened to him, but the more he does it, the more he realizes that his voice has power. Darnell has always been a quiet person, a man who prefers to stay in the background. But now, with the weight of his experience pushing him forward, he knows he has to be heard. He can't let this moment pass without doing something meaningful with it. For 8 days, Darnell has lain in hospital beds. Protests become a regular part of his life. He stands shoulder to shoulder with others who share his pain, his frustration, his hope for change. It's not always easy. The streets are full of tension, of people who are tired of waiting for justice. Darnell feels that same exhaustion in his bones, but he knows that every march, every protest, is a step towards something greater. A world where people like him don't have to live in fear of being misunderstood or unjustly treated. But activism isn't just about showing up in the streets. It's about educating, about reaching those who might not understand what it's like to live in a system that doesn't protect you. Darnell begins hosting discussions in his community, talking to young men and women who, like him, feel powerless in a world that often seems stacked against them. He tells his story not for pity, but to show them that they're not alone, that their experiences, no matter how painful, matter. The more he speaks, the more he understands how deep the problem runs. Police brutality and racial profiling aren't just headlines. They are lived realities for people who have been forced to survive in a system that often doesn't see their humanity. Darnell is no longer just a victim of the system. He's a voice for the voiceless, a bridge between those who are fighting for change and those who still don't see the need for it. Slowly, he begins to see his own growth. The journey isn't easy, and there are days when the weight of it all threatens to crush him. But each time he stands up, each time he speaks out, he feels stronger. The injustice he faced is no longer something that defines him, but something that propels him forward, giving him the courage to push against the walls of a system that would rather see him silenced. As Darnell looks back on the man he was just a few weeks ago, he doesn't recognize him anymore. He's no longer just a man trying to get by, trying to survive in a world that doesn't understand him. He's someone with a purpose, someone who has found his voice in the midst of chaos and fear. And while the road to redemption is long and filled with challenges, Darnell knows he's walking it a life, one step at a time. As Darnell stands before the crowd, his words echo in the air, but it's the faces in the audience that truly capture his attention. The young people before him are not just listening, they are absorbing, connecting with his story, feeling the weight of his words. Some of them nod in silent agreement, while others look back at him with wide, searching eyes. Darnell realizes in that moment that his journey hasn't just been about his own healing or activism. It's about showing others that they are seen, heard, and understood. He finishes his speech with a sense of conviction that he hadn't felt before. The anger, the frustration, the sense of helplessness, all of it has transformed into something greater. He has found not just his voice, but his purpose, Standing in front of these young faces, he knows that his story has touched them in ways he never anticipated. This is why he fought through the dark moments, the uncertainty, and the emotional toll. Let him sit there, slowly, watching them to make sure others don't feel like they're alone in their struggles. And then, as the crowd begins to disperse, a young man steps forward. His voice trembles slightly, but his words carry the weight of someone who has been waiting to hear this message. "Thank you," he says, his voice filled with raw sincerity. "You've given me hope. I thought I was the only one going through this." "Thank you," she says, then falls completely still. The words hit Darnell in a way that's hard to explain. He smiles, a genuine, heartwarming smile, as he reaches out to shake the young man's hand. In that moment, Darnell feels a profound connection, a realization that the pain he experienced wasn't in vain. His suffering has become a source of strength, not just for him, but for others who now see a way forward. As the event winds down, Darnell takes a step back and surveys the room. The pain he once felt in that holding cell, the helplessness and anger, no longer consumes him. Instead, he stands as a symbol of resistance, of resilience, and of hope. He is no longer defined by the wrongful arrest, the injustice, or the system that failed him. He is defined by the man he has become, someone who has turned the darkest moments of his life into a force for good. Someone who has given a voice to those who have been silenced for far too long. In that small, quiet moment, Darnell understands the full weight of his journey. He has found peace, not through erasing the past, but by transforming it into something that helps others. He knows the road is long, and the fight is far from over. But as he stands among these young faces, he realizes that the battle for justice has become more than just his personal struggle. It's a collective fight, a fight that, together, they will continue to win.
If I have a chance, help you move ahead.
As Darnell walks home, the cool evening air brushes against his face, and the weight of the night's events lingers in his mind. His steps are steady, yet each one feels different now. Heavier, but not from burden. Instead, there's a sense of purpose that accompanies him as he walks through the streets he once felt disconnected from. The city is the same, but to him, it now feels like part of the canvas on which he is painting a new future. He reflects on how far he's come, the transformation that has taken place within him. The wrongful arrest, the frustration, the anger. It was all part of the journey, but it no longer defines him. Those moments, once filled with powerlessness, have become the fuel for something far greater. What he has learned is that redemption isn't about erasing the mistakes or wounds of the past. It's about how we rise from them, how we take those painful experiences and forge them into strength, into wisdom, into action. He thinks about the young man who thanked him earlier, how that one moment made him realize that the work he's doing matters. It's not just about his own healing, it's about creating a ripple effect, inspiring others to stand up, to speak out, to demand the change that has been long overdue. His voice is no longer just a whisper in the crowd. It's a call to action, a rallying cry for those who have been silenced for too long. Darnell isn't just a victim of a broken system anymore. He's a warrior for change. He's learned to take the power from the injustices he's faced and turn them into something positive. The anger and frustration that once threatened to consume him now serve as the spark that fuels his fight for justice. As he turns the corner toward his apartment, Darnell knows this is only the beginning. There is still much work to be done, much to fight for. But tonight, as he reflects on everything he's overcome, he feels a deep sense of peace. He has found his purpose, and with that, the road ahead feels clearer than ever. His journey is far from over, but Darnell Mitchell is ready to face it head-on, stronger and more determined than ever before.